evening. I'm Tom Fenton, and I have with me tonight Tony Wood, who has written a book that I in fact read today. It's incisive. It's factual. If you don't know an awful lot about Chechnya, you will by the time you've finished with it. It's also a passionate plea for independence for a country that is largely ignored these days by most of the rest of the world. Some would say shamefully so, others would say deservedly. I leave it to you to make your own judgments on this. And then to counterbalance Tony just a bit, there's Tom de Waal, who was in Moscow with me in the mid-'90s at a time when it was possible to cover the war, the first war in Chechnya without being embedded, and who at the time wrote a book with Tom de Waal on the first Chechen war. I assume some of you will know an awful lot about Chechnya. Others will be learning things for the first time, but I hope we can all profit from this. And I think perhaps we can first start with Tony, who is incidentally the assistant editor of the New Left Review. I forgot to get in, and whose book is available here for those who have a real interest and would like to know more. Perhaps you could start by simply explaining briefly the background of Chechnya and what the Chechens are demanding and why they're demanding it.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Tom, and thank you everyone for coming along this evening. Those of you who are familiar with Chechnya will have to forgive me while I briefly explain what it is and where it is. It's a region on the north side of the Caucasus Mountains, which spread between the Black Sea and Caspian Seas. It's a very dramatic landscape, very high mountains. It's roughly 600 miles in length, I think. Chechnya itself is around half the size of Belgium, although with considerably more interesting terrain. It has a population of just under 1 million, I think, although for reasons that will become clear throughout the evening, it's very difficult to get an accurate grasp of anything statistical in Chechnya at present. The Chechens have a long history of resistance to Russian rule, which stretches back to the colonization of the whole region by the Russian Empire as of the late 18th century. This has taken various forms, but it's broken out into armed rebellion at very specific points in the 19th century and occasionally in the 20th century too. The defining moment of Chechen history, if you like, is the deportations of 1944. The Chechens and several other North Caucasian Muslim peoples were rounded up by Stalin and deported to Central Asia en masse. This was ostensibly for collaborating with the Nazis, although this is actually dubious, on dubious grounds factually. They returned from this deportation in the 50s, and there was a sort of strange situation where you have the Russian settlers, if you like, who've arrived in the interim, occupying a lot of the positions of political power and the good jobs, and the Chechens, by and large, excluded from this, although this is not watertight distinction. These are the sort of social tensions, if you like, leading up to the push for independence in 1991. That's the sort of broad background, if you like. Now we've arrived at 1991, I guess I should spell out what the arguments for independence are, because this is what they presented at that time. And then Tom can come in and object on various grounds as he will. The arguments actually fall broadly into three categories, I would say. One is the grounds of principle. There's the basic principle of self-determination of peoples, which is enshrined in international law, and it's been accorded to numerous peoples worldwide, and it's the reason why there are so many states in the world. It was on these principles, for example, that many of the present states of Eastern Europe were formed after the First World War. So on those grounds, one would say the Chechens are a distinct unit who share language, customs, religion, historical experience, and they're entitled to seek sovereignty as much as any other people. The legal and constitutional grounds, this can rapidly get very technical, so I'll try not to exhaust anyone's patience with that, but suffice to say that the Soviet Union had this sort of structure of 15 federal republics which were allowed to leave. Chechnya was not one of these 15 until April 1990, when Gorbachev elevated it to this status. And the fact of the matter is that the Chechens seized this opportunity, and none of the other republics did. So the Chechens were left in this isolated position of taking advantage of this constitutional oddity when no one else did. And it's because of this there was so little support from other Russian federal subunits throughout the 90s. In addition to these arguments of principle and the legal and constitutional ones, I think there is an increasingly strong moral argument. The Chechens, I think, pushed for a national state in 1991 largely in response to the trauma of 1944. There is this recurrent thing you'll hear Chechens say, that every generation experiences some attempt to wipe it out. And for them, 1944 was proof that they wouldn't be safe within the borders of anyone else's state. And I think, as the 90s have proved, they've had 2 full-scale military onslaughts from the world's 4th largest army. The death toll is very hard to estimate, but may have accounted for as much as 10% of the population, but that's very, very conservative. So I think you'll see that they feel sovereignty at least would be some sort of self-defense. In terms of what they want, in addition to sovereignty, there's actually very little. And they've repeatedly, in previous times, proposed to the Russians that we would remain within the ruble zone, so we won't have our own currency. We will remain within the Russian security and defense space, i.e. we will not join NATO, as Georgia and other former Soviet countries did. So the demands are very moderate, and I think they're based on a recognition that Chechnya is very much bound to Russia in economic terms, in social terms. They have a shared Soviet experience, if you like, of education, and many of the generation older than about 40, say, would have strong memories of the Soviet Union. I think that's roughly it so far.
Tom, the rest of the world has largely ignored these demands, rightfully so?
Well, let me sort of try and come at this. I don't want this to become a sort of polemic, because in many ways I liked Tony's book very much. I thought it was a good piece of research. But I come at this, shall we say, from a different point. So this is I'll come at it from a different point and say that my own background, say a little bit about my own background in Chechnya, which was that I was a reporter in Moscow, and just by chance happened to start going to Chechnya about a year before the first Russian invasion, so in January of '94, and then went to Chechnya, so before the war, during the first war, and then afterwards, up until about 1998. Although I'm regarded as an expert on Chechnya, I haven't actually been in Chechnya itself since 1998. I've been in the northwest of the North Caucasus since then, but I do work for the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, editing articles about Chechnya and keep in touch with a lot of Chechens. And I fully endorse Tony's point about the terrible suffering that Chechens have endured, and I believe that it's a stain on the conscience of many countries, including our own, that little was done to condemn that. And I should also say that I last year was refused a visa to Russia, presumably for my activities about Chechnya. So I hope I made it clear that I'm very sympathetic to the Chechens on many counts, and have indeed lost my right to go to Russia as a result. But it seems to me that independence is the wrong question to pose for the Chechens, certainly at this point. It may be the right question in the future, but it seems to me that we should be, when we're talking about Chechnya, and we should be talking about it a lot more, we should be talking about human rights, we should be talking about economic investment, we should be talking about international attention. And actually, from the Chechens I talk to and the reports I edit, I do see no evidence that independence is really on anyone's agenda at the moment. And there are various reasons for that. A primary one being that twice the Chechens have had de facto independence, and in my view, both times it didn't deliver. And in fact, I saw both times de facto independent Chechnya, 91 to 94, when Chechnya was under Dudayev, And basically, independence was a mirage. I mean, you could fly directly from Moscow to Grozny on a plane. The borders were completely open. Chechnya was fully part of Russia's economic space. And yet also, Chechens could also fly abroad from Grozny airport because they were with typical Chechen entrepreneurial skill, they were able to bribe Russian air traffic controllers and so on. So actually, Chechnya was really pretty much a free economic zone at that point. And yet, nothing much happened that was good for Chechnya in that 3-year period, apart from a feeling of resurgence of national pride, a feeling of sort of cultural discussion, important things, but on a basic state-building level, absolutely nothing happened. And indeed, when Dudayev talked about independence, he actually was prepared basically to sacrifice most of what was actually independence in favor of basically self-rule within Russia. So it was really an issue of freedom and respect. Again, in 1998, Chechnya, the Chechens having defeated the Russian army in 96, I went back. Chechnya was again de facto independent, and I have to say it was a complete catastrophe. And of course the Russians share responsibility for this, but we're talking about a state which had public executions for people accused of adultery. We talk about Islamists flooding in from abroad, some of them quite scary. We know that Ayman al-Zawahiri was on his way to Chechnya and ended up in a Dagestani jail for 6 months under a false name. We're talking about number 2 in Al-Qaeda. We're talking about mass kidnapping. Again, a place where the borders were open, where Chechnya had some oil wealth. So potentially there was opportunity for state building, but not a single school was opened. There was very much a division between us and them. Anyone who supports Russia is a traitor. And it was really a catastrophe. So we have to say independence did not deliver twice for Chechnya. Now, the other points, I guess, where I dissent a bit from Tony is one, I would say that I think it's no longer useful to talk about there being a war in Chechnya. I would describe it more as a kind of human rights disaster zone, where there is a kind of a rather nasty kind of Latin American or Central American state where there are kind of paramilitaries who rove around and have very kind of mafia-like economic interests. But there's not basically a war going on there anymore. I mean, 300 people were kidnapped there last year, which is a shocking statistic. And a few people die every week in shooting incidents. But I think it's hard to say what those shooting incidents are about. I don't believe it's a guerrilla army fighting the Russians. I believe it's more about kind of economic and criminal groups fighting each other. And basically the pro-independence guerrilla movement, most of the moderate leaders have been wiped out, including President Maskhadov, who I knew and respected, and in their place there's a very shadowy group of Islamists have taken over. I suppose the other point on which I disagree with Tony is that he describes the current regime in Chechnya as a puppet regime. The Ramzan Kadyrov, who's now currently the president, and his father, who was also the president. Now, these are not savory people at all. I want to make that clear. They're very frightening people in many ways. They're responsible for many human rights abuses. But it's not true to say they're a puppet regime. They do represent a significant force, and I believe quite a popular force within Chechnya, a kind of gangster nationalism. And it's significant that a number of people who were former rebels have gone over to this regime, and basically the Kadyrov's guards are basically former rebels. Both Kadyrov and his father actually fought on the Chechen rebel side in the first war, and their split with the other rebels was partly opportunistic and they wanted power and money, but also partly religious, that they were part of a traditional Chechen religious current which was frightened about the Islamists. So I think they do have significant support. And the younger Kadyrov, who's an extremely unsavory character, has, it has to be said, delivered some things to Chechnya. People who've been there recently say that there is a phenomenal amount of rebuilding, that Russian troops are basically retreated to their barracks, checkpoints have been taken down, shops are open, some normal life is now returning to Chechnya, and so he is the only game in town, basically. So whether we like him or not, he is a reality, and he's a kind of new type of Chechen nationalism which basically trades with Moscow. And so I think we have to sort of concentrate a bit more on the kind of Chechen's pragmatic tradition. There are small people who've lived for a long time within the Russian Empire, and they're quite good at sort of accommodating, at sort of basically keeping Moscow at arm's length, pretending that they're part of the Russian Empire and doing their own thing. And in a sense, that's what's going on at the moment. So you could say that to talk about independence and struggle for Chechnya is actually possibly doing the Chechens more harm than good. What they want is more international attention. What they want is economic investment. If the war is over, that's a good thing. That's not something that we should be sad about. It means that international agencies can move in there and do more help. We shouldn't be sorry that if this guerrilla movement is finished. That's actually not a bad thing necessarily. So we should be trying to get more international attention in Chechnya to deal with its huge human rights and economic needs. And sure, I think the issue of independence will come back, but maybe we should wait 15 or 20 years for it to do so.
Tony, do you see any weaknesses in these arguments against sovereignty now?
No. This is the short answer. I can give you the longer answer where I'd seek to argue with many of the points that Tom has just raised, actually. I'm not quite sure the order in which to take them, because in some way they do all sort of intermesh. The first is just a factual one. I think you're wrong to describe it as a place where there is no war happening. The Russians have 40,000 troops in a region with a population of under 1 million. They lose between 2 and 3 soldiers a week to landmines or picked off by separatist patrols. This is somewhere it's maybe low intensity, but I think the best description is a counterinsurgency war of the kind, for example, that I think Colombia is a relevant comparison in a strange way, because there you have an insurgency that's lasted about, 35, 40 years, operating in very defined areas of territory. That seems to be the case in Chechnya, that it seems to be more predictable now where violence will occur, but it does not mean it will not happen. The terrain is such, and the degree of popular support for the insurgency is such, that this can continue indefinitely at the present level, which I don't think is a good thing. Secondly, following on from that, if the present level of hostilities can be sustained indefinitely, and the price that one is paying for that low level of hostilities is a gangster regime that robs its citizens blind and periodically kidnaps and tortures and kills them, I don't think that is a price worth paying either. Following on from that, I think it is completely true. I'm entirely with you on the idea that one has to get humanitarian assistance to the Chechens and one has to address human rights abuses. I'm absolutely in agreement with that. That is not incompatible with beginning political discussions on the question of sovereignty. As far as I'm concerned, the conflict will continue, and all of these ugly symptoms which you've described will continue until the core political question is addressed. One can cite numerous examples around the world of insurgencies which did not fizzle out until the political question was addressed, and this is because there is no military answer to this. You've seen it in Northern Ireland, you've seen it to a certain extent in the Basque Country too. You've not seen it in Colombia because they've dealt with it purely as a military affair, and this is why the insurgency is still happening. The other thing I would say is that you mentioned the disappointments of independence and the 3 years of de facto independence that Chechnya had, and I fully agree with your assessment that these were periods of dismal failure. I don't think one could hold these up as proud examples by any standard, but the operative term here is de facto independence. This was not full sovereignty, this was not full international recognition, and I think this imposes a number of obstacles, if you like. Without international recognition, you cannot raise international aid. You cannot apply for funds from international agencies as a sovereign entity because you have to do it all through the Russians. all of these obstacles were present. I think the Chechens didn't do themselves any favors, but they were very, very actively blocked from getting foreign aid by the Russians at this time. The Russians threatened to break off relations with any country that recognized Chechnya. And this, for many countries, is a very serious threat. So I think whilst not removing blame entirely from the Chechens, this is not what I'm saying, but one has to be clear that the failures of independence were not the failures of sovereignty per se. They were the failures of this intermediate status where it's not clear what one's status is. And I think this is very important because people do talk about sovereignty as some form of fiction, and it's really not relevant in an age where we're also globally interconnected. I think this is a very important fiction as it happens because it determines the juridical basis on which one state will relate to another. If you don't have that basis, you don't have the basis for any kind of interrelations, and you don't have any of the responsibilities that come with it. And I think genuine sovereignty and genuine recognition would impose burdens on the Chechens as well as enabling them to gain access to things they need.
Maybe it's time to open this up to the audience. I'm sure some of you agree with Tony, others don't. That's the first hand right there. And would you please swallow the mic practically? You have to be right up next to it.
Thank you. My name's Timothy Less. I will declare I'm utterly agnostic on this point of whether Chechnya should or should not become independent. But I have two questions, one for Tony and one for Tom. Tom, first, starting with you. I wonder where you stand on the Kosovo issue. It's a country I had to work on for a number of years, and there would seem to be a number of striking similarities between the status of Kosovo now and that of Chechnya, a country which has enjoyed far-reaching autonomy at periods in the past, has been subjugated by the titular nation, and on the genesis of its fully independent life would appear to be saddled with all the sorts of problems of criminality and poor governance, which you rightfully ascribe to Chechnya. And a question for Tony as well. How could you avoid a situation in which Chechnya is granted independence without setting an extremely dangerous precedent for other separatist regions around the world which may wish to secede from their titular countries and therefore posing an enormous shock to global stability?
Tony, parallels with Kosovo?
I'm Tom.
I'm Tom, sorry. I'm Tom.
Yes, rather confusing, isn't it? On the Kosovo issue, I've actually written about this, funnily enough, more with relation to Abkhazia in the South Caucasus. And it seems to me that the interesting... I'm quite relaxed about separatism in a way. I think that people should have the right to aspire to independence, and I include the Chechens and the Abkhaz on this. But I think we should set them quite a tough exam to pass, and I think the Kosovans have done quite well. I mean, and even under the old Yugoslavia, they had their own parallel structures and parallel government and education and so on. And you know, if you set the exam to the Abkhaz, they've done moderately well. They've built a sort of de facto state there, although I think they have they would have to do a lot more to claim independence. But I don't think we should deny them the right to aspire to it. When it comes to the Chechens, much as I admire the Chechens in many ways, I see absolutely zero, and again, this is a point I have to come back to, zero state building there. I don't see that the Dudayev regime or the Muscatov regime pretty much knocked in a nail, unfortunately, much as I'd hoped they would. I mean, they regarded independence as a time of just sort of enormous freedom, which became anarchy, and there was no state building. The money that they did have, which flowed from their own oil wealth or from abroad when the borders were open, seemed to get plundered and didn't get invested into any kind of state building. So this, for me, sure, I believe that they should have the right to aspire to independence, but I would again come back to the point. So far, they had two chances to aspire, and both times they failed.
Tony.
Well, I mean, in a way, this follows on from what Tom was saying. And the question of separatism, I think, has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. The way that you're posing the question is effectively, we have to draw the line somewhere. Is that more or less what you're saying?
I don't accept the assumption, because international law doesn't operate on a case-by-case basis. It operates on the basis of precedents.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But surely you can only take each case as it comes. I don't think you can set a sort of global rules.
The principles of case law dictate. The principles of case law dictate, of course, that once you've set a new precedent, then others can therefore follow, and that precedent is in effect a test case. Mm-hmm. But I think my point still stands that well, you take the point anyway, so I don't need to repeat it.
I mean, Tom is right that Kosovo will set a new precedent in that Kosovo is not, was not a federal subunit of Yugoslavia and therefore does not, under current international law, have the right to secede because it was not one of the highest subunits of that entity. I think the problem with this argument for me is that one does have to draw the line somewhere, I agree, but I don't see why it should be here. That this is what I mean by assessing things on a case-by-case basis, that, for example, I think many people would have had the same argument about East Timor several years ago, but East Timor has now gained statehood in 2002. Many people would have had the same argument about Eritrea, but the line has to be drawn somewhere, and one doesn't want to encourage too much fragmentation, especially in Africa. The Eritreans carried on regardless and got their statehood in 93. Africa hasn't fallen apart. There are numerous other cases one could cite. I think in the case of Chechnya, what has happened to Chechnya has been such a massive disaster that it would entirely dissuade anyone else from going for it, firstly. Secondly, the Chechens are an absolute majority in their territory, which is not true of many other nationalities in Russia. Thirdly, they have actively pushed for independence on several times and gained it twice, which has not happened in any of the other Russian territories. I don't see that they would suddenly start emulating the example of the Chechens now, because the time to do so would surely have been 91 when there was some momentum behind it. I was just going to come back actually to the question of East Timor in relation to what Tom said, because you were talking about people being set an exam for sovereignty, and really if you don't pass the exam, you don't get the prize. I think really that there are numerous very poor, unstable countries which have gained independence and failed many, many exams, and this has not been seen as a reason to withdraw sovereignty. East Timor last year was in the throes of a very severe constitutional crisis. The Prime Minister and President at loggerheads, police and army at loggerheads again, many, many people killed, refugees fleeing the capital. What happened? Sovereignty was not withdrawn. The UN sent 3,000 peacekeepers. So I think there are different ways of dealing with failures in the exam, and I think one shouldn't treat it as an absolute failure. I think one should see how one can help countries that have got themselves into these problems.
Does anyone have strong views?
Well, but perhaps I can make a comment first and then ask a question. A comment is about making a comparison between what happened in 91-94 and blaming the Chechens for the failures that were absolutely apparent in that period of time. I would say that the entire former Soviet Union was exactly the same problem. It was a mess wherever you look.
Could I interrupt for just a second? Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Alan Bhatti. I'm a lawyer actually living in Azerbaijan, so very close to the region, and I meet the odd Chechen from time to time because there is a Chechen community of refugees living in Azerbaijan. But the whole of the former Soviet Union was in a mess in that period. And whichever country you look at, you've got a disaster as far as leaders are concerned. And Dudayev was a disaster because he was a former Soviet. He was a member of the military establishment. One of the reasons why the Soviets did not hammer him was because a lot of his buddies were in the Air Force and they didn't want to bomb the hell out of him. So, using that period as an example for the Chechens not having handled themselves properly is not a particularly good example because the whole former Soviet Union was in exactly the same position. My question is one on the constitutionality of independence. My understanding is, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that at the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, made up of these republics, asked the republics to sign up to a Russian Federation treaty, and Chechnya did not sign that treaty. Therefore, it never became legally a part of Russia. Am I right?
Yes. Just one small thing I would add to that, actually, if I can. There's a very interesting thing, which is that Chechnya and Ingushetia are now Ingushetia is a federal subunit of Russia. Chechnya, we're arguing about the status of at present. But in the constitution, according to which the Russians wanted to put this thing back together after the fall of the Soviet Union, Chechnya and Ingushetia were one thing. The separation of Chechnya from Ingushetia was done purely on local initiative through a democratically organized referendum. So the Russians have effectively recognized the results of that local expression of popular will in the case of Ingushetia, and not done so in the case of Chechnya. It's a sort of constitutional irregularity, double standards.
Sir.
Thank you. My name is Art. English, or rather American accent, but Russian background, or Ukrainian rather. However, left of center. So my understanding, I'm not an expert, but one of the interests that Russia has in this whole topic is that Chechnya is essentially a mafia terrorist state, possibly a narco-terrorist state from many perspectives there, which doesn't just stay isolated and simmer in its own juices, but actually penetrates into Russia and has impact in Russia. And that is one of the driving interests of an attempted control, an attempted suppression of what's going on there. So A, is that the case? B, if it is the case, why wouldn't Russia be justified in doing what it's doing? And then C, if Russia is not justified, how do other regions in the world deal with such situations?
Tom.
Well, I wouldn't agree with the description narco-terrorist state. I mean, obviously the Chechens had a very feared mafia within Russia, as did many other nationalities, including the Azerbaijanis, for example. But and this is in a way a product of a whole generation who were sent into deportation by Stalin, who sort of lived beyond the law. But then, you know, there's a suburb of Moscow called Saltsevo, which has a famous mafia, and the Russian Air Force didn't bomb Saltsevo, so it's not really a justification for military intervention. But I do think there is a security issue here, and I do think that much as we don't like the Russian state, most of us, probably in this room, or find it have many problems with it, we do have to, I think, accept that the second Chechnya spell of independence was quite scary. That there were people being kidnapped outside Chechnya's borders in places like Dagestan. There were some pretty scary people there. I myself bumped into a gentleman called Emir al-Khattab one day, and he was from Saudi Arabia and had fought in Afghanistan and made his way to Chechnya. And certainly I didn't think he had the Chechens' best interests at heart. He was basically fighting a jihad. So I think that is an issue, that when Chechnya had open borders, wrongly in my view, jihadis from around the world thought they're thinking that this is a new Islamic jihad. So I think that is an issue which came up, and I think the Russians exploited that in a very cynical way. But it's true that there was an element of that. And I think part of the reason that I think I disagree with Tony's thesis is that I think that most Chechens actually have now rejected what happened to them in the last 15 years. Obviously, they've rejected the Russian invasion and what the Russians did to them, but they've also rejected what their own pro-independence leaders gave them, which was very little, which is why they're desperately seeking some kind of third choice.
Are there any Chechens in the audience? Sir.
My name is Isa Tashev.
Please speak very into the mic.
Yeah, sorry. I'm not used to this kind of audience, and my English skills, I'm sorry for that. But I'd like to say that Tom's description of the situation in Chechnya sounds to me like an advocacy for Russian policy modern policy in Chechnya, and I bet if he tries to get Russian visa now, he'll get it. Sure. Yeah. What I'd like to say, yeah, the general picture is good, but I'm Chechen, and I've lost 4 brothers during this conflict. I was wounded myself and transported out of Chechnya. And since then, I've been traveling around the world. I've seen Azerbaijani community. I've seen all the Chechens, their life. And during these 400 years of period, since we met with Russians first, since Russia became great, so-called state, and invaded to Caucasus, we had to survive, in a tied relation, with the tied relationships, and that made us kind of, let's say, as some people said here, mafia or something like that, because as Tony said, we were deported, we were executed, and the population, despite our families have large amount of children, our population never grew up over 1 million people. It tells a lot to me, because it's been a loss all the times. I'm not judging Russian community, Russian people. I know they wouldn't do this if you ask them personally, but the policy, the imperialistic policy in Caucasus and around the world, how would you expect Chechnya, my question is, to do so quick improvements towards democracy and independence during few years of so-called peace in Chechnya, after separating, by conflict from such a state like Russia, which, used to keep all the world in kind of threat. How would you expect them, Mr. Dudayev or Maskhadov, to do it in such quick way? Well, I was 19, 18 perhaps, at that time when we gained so-called independence, and Jokhar Dudayev came to power, and I became a soldier because we had compulsory service at that time. I remember himself. I knew him personally. He was a great man, I think. But it was not enough, his will to do something for Chechens was not enough without international support to move towards proper independence and to lead Chechen people before they get radicalized to kind of peace and democracy. How would you expect that to happen? If you go back to 1917s and remember the Soviet Union formation, and then look at the history of Soviet Union development, you'll be able to understand what they went through during that time. It was a large part of the world trying to get to unite as a state, and it took them about 3 decades to do that. And they went through the hell. So that's my opinion, really. And if anyone thinks that he knows better than I do about Chechen issue, let's discuss, and I'll tell you what's what. The modern situation is the current situation in Chechnya. People, kind of peace, stability, but people live under threat. If you take them out individually to Britain, to Europe, and ask them, what would you like? Would you like to live within Russia or independently? You will find your answer. And now, brother afraid to talk to his brother. If your sister has been kidnapped and raped, you're afraid to say that you will seek a revenge. You're afraid to say that openly. And you always praise the Ramzan Kadyrov, the president of Chechnya. That's ridiculous.
Thank you, sir. Tony, are we expecting too much of the Chechens?
Well, I think that's a very relevant point to make, that they basically had 3 years in which they were expected to build viable state institutions, and I think you'll find in most cases in the world this didn't happen, simply. You have to also remember that the entire country had been pulverized by the Russian military in the previous 2 years, so one is not talking about building state institutions on a level field, one is talking about building it on a moonscape, if you like, with no viable physical infrastructure, let alone personnel, educational infrastructure, any of these things. And I think it would take a very long time. I think the so-called reconstruction of Grozny that is taking place at the moment is actually a very good illustration of the same process, because the Russians are supposedly in full control of the city. It's been 4.5 years. It's just the very center of Grozny with a line of buildings on each street, but it's less than a building deep. Most of the city doesn't have running water. There's very little electricity supply. This is a very, very large power awash with oil money, which has had 4 years to rebuild one city of an original population of 400,000 people, and 85% of the city is still rubble. So I think if the Russians can't do it, I don't see why one should have expected the Chechens to do so in an even shorter period.
I think it's amazing that Chechens survive at all in that city. I've never understood how people could live in buildings that look like Swiss cheese, with no running water, with no electricity, with none of the amenities. It seems almost a miracle. Does anybody else want to? Sir.
My name is Tom Oliver, and I have no expertise in this subject at all. I have two questions. The first one is to both our speakers, which is to say, are you primarily motivated in your view about what should happen next by a humanitarian desire for Chechens and others who live in Chechnya to be free from persecution and able to express themselves? Or do you have other reasons behind why you believe what you do? And the second question is, can you tell us a little bit more about the Russians' motivation in all this? I'm actually quite interested to know more about that, because there are obvious solutions as to why the Russians are interested in Chechnya, but are they really true? And is there a rather more interesting story to tell about that?
Tom, you want to start with that?
Yeah, well, definitely, I'm very, ever since I first went to Chechnya in the beginning of '94, I feel very a personal sort of entwinement, if you want, with Chechnya, and I still have many Chechen friends. And although I certainly respect the position of our friend over here, most of the Chechens I know are much more skeptical about what Dudayev and so on brought them. So for me, the goal is certainly a peaceful Chechnya, certainly a restoration of some kind of normality, a sort of lifting of the Russian military presence there. So definitely I have a very kind of, obviously, try and analyze the place, but I do have feel a very kind of personal stake in the hope that Chechnya becomes a normal place, which for me is why I want to take the question of independence out of the equation, at least for the time being, because that's what I believe is the position of most Chechens, that peace and normality and reconstruction come first, and then those kind of political issues come later. As for the Russian motivation, I think Russia basically, and this is the great tragedy of the totally needless military intervention in Chechnya in 1994, I think Russia is still living very much with its kind of 20th century past, the Stalinist legacy. And I think the big Russian problem here is that they say that Chechnya is part of Russia, and yet they regard the Chechens as somehow other, not as our people, but as other people. So the Chechens have the worst of both worlds. They're both others, they're both alien, and yes, they're part of Russia. And so, which is why I do absolutely think that there is a fundamental problem there. What's strange is that the Chechens actually are much more pragmatic. The Chechen, I mean, I would constantly meet Chechen fighters, in a village somewhere in Vedeno at the height of the war, who would say, "Oh yes, and my sister's living in Moscow." And we shouldn't believe that these people are Afghan mujahideen. These people were deeply part of the same Russian-Soviet space as the people who were attacking them. And this is, in a sense, one of the tragedies of this conflict. So that there is actually innumerable ties between Russia and Chechnya, very complicated ones, but quite strong ones.
Tony, could you talk specifically about President Putin? What's in it for him? How has he used Chechnya?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. The question of Russian motivations has actually changed a great deal over the course of the two wars. I agree with Tom that the 94 invasion was a completely needless attack on a people who shared a great deal with the Russians. The problem was really that once the Russians had been forced to withdraw in 1996, this became a very significant defeat for them. And it's not an exaggeration to say that the defeat in Chechnya was something like Vietnam for the Americans, that this is a real problem that we have to overcome. The Russians got a second bite at it, if you like, in 1999, with an invasion that, again, was a totally disproportionate and illegitimate response to an armed incursion into Dagestan. It's really, the proper response would have been some sort of police operation in coordination with the Chechen authorities, who offered to extradite these people, as far as I remember. Putin very, very clearly used Chechnya to stir up Russian nationalist sentiment, and Chechnya rapidly became almost, I mean, it's an exaggeration to call it a pathology, but certainly it's something that the Russians very clearly feel they have to expunge from the historical record. And this is why Russian TV presents this narrative of stabilization, normalization. On the few occasions that Chechnya is mentioned at all, it's that everything is going very well. This is, I think, a lie. But the story is there to reassure Russians that this defeat will not happen again. Everything has been sorted out, and it's thanks to Mr. Putin and his friends.
Sir, gentleman in the back on the right.
On the second, Robert Hannah, I'm the Kingston Peace Council. I've got a question. You did reply a little bit to it, but one of the reasons for the Second War was bombs in, was it Moscow, or some apartment buildings were blown up, and Putin said it was Chechen terrorists who did this, and that was the justification he used for the Second War invasion. But some people said, like this man Lipidenko, who's just recently been assassinated here, that it was really the Russian Secret Service who did that, to pretend that it was a Chechen. Have you any view on that?
Well, the circumstances around the bombings were extremely murky. I think one can very rapidly get into all sorts of conspiracy theories. What I will say is that there are a number of very, very worrying irregularities. There were FSB agents found in a cellar planting sacks of what they called sugar, but actually turned out to be explosives, and then they took 3 days to declare it was a training exercise. So if a state behaves like that with its own citizens, one is slightly worried about the implications of something of the earlier bombings which took place, but I wouldn't conclusively go one way or the other. What I would say about the bombings, though, is that the people they prosecuted for the bombings were not Chechens but Dagestanis. So if the Russians couldn't even pin these crimes on Chechens with the whole apparatus of state at their disposal, I think it's very unlikely that the Chechens were at all involved.
Just a question of my own, Tony, as a practical matter. If Chechnya were given independence, you've got this thing sticking up inside the Russian Federation with Dagestan on one side and Ingushetia on the other side, and the mountains behind them. Is it really feasible or practical?
Well, the question of practicality is quite an interesting one, but I think it's distinct from the question of sovereignty and international law. I think if you look through the list of members of the UN, of which at last count there are 192, I think, I would bet that a very sizable proportion of those were not economically viable entities, not self-sustaining and entirely dependent on someone else's largesse or economic interrelations. And I think the same would apply to Chechnya. It's obviously a very small country. It depends on links with its neighbors. But you have to remember, these neighbors, they've been neighbors for thousands of years. So there's no reason to suppose that because of a juridical change in status, all of these relations would evaporate. There's a very interesting thing when I discuss it with Russian friends, and they say, but if Chechnya became independent, where would it go? As if independence means physically picking it up and taking it somewhere else. That's not really what it's about. It's about the juridical framework in which you relate one state to another. And I think, given that is a pragmatic political question, one can always arrive at a solution.
Sir, the second row.
Louis Gregg is my name. I'm on the committee of Human Rights Watch. I was just going to ask you, I'd like to ask each of you, the conflict has broadened out quite a lot in neighbouring countries. Perhaps you could just comment on the extent of that, the nature of that, and how you think that plays to this particular debate.
Yes, it's true that, in fact, when we now say Chechnya, we should really be talking about the North Caucasus as a whole, because I think Tony would agree with me that we agree on the definition of what's going on in Chechnya, whether it's a human rights problem or a low-intensity conflict. But certainly the level of violence there is very low compared to what it was, thank God, a few years ago. And yet, in Dagestan, Ingushetia, other places in the North Caucasus, the violence is up. So we're talking about the kind of explosive material lowering in Chechnya and, as it were, spreading to the rest of the North Caucasus. It's becoming a problem in the rest of the North Caucasus, fired by radical Islam, fired by social discontent. And in a sense, nationalism has decreased. And I don't think I would doubt very much that many of these people who are still somewhere in the forest of Chechnya have a sort of copy of the Chechen constitution in their hands. They're much more powered by revenge, by Islamist beliefs and so on. And therefore they have common cause with people who aren't Chechens, who are Dagestanis or Balkars or Ingush. And you have these funny Jamats, they're called, these kind of shadowy underground Islamist groups who it's very hard to see what their agenda is, who pop up occasionally and kill a couple of policemen and disappear. So yes, the North Caucasus as a whole is becoming sort of this rather shadowy, unstable place and diverging really from Russia as a whole. Russia as a whole, as we know, the economy is improving compared to the 90s. There are improvements, and the North Caucasus is actually getting worse.
Tony, is the spreading unrest in the North Caucasus not an argument against immediate sovereignty?
No, in fact, I think it's an argument for. What you really see in the North Caucasus, in my view, is actually two struggles that have been allowed to become one by errors of Russian strategy and policy. You have a Chechen nationalist insurgency, which has taken on an Islamist colouring as the years have gone on, although I would argue that this oscillates depending on who they're asking for money. I think the Chechen national struggle has sought allies wherever it can find them. This includes funding from the Gulf, but it also includes Islamist groups in neighbouring republics who can make a common cause. I think by removing the national question from this, you reduce these two struggles you separate these two struggles out from each other.
What happens to the so-called Wahhabis?
This is the next part of the answer. The problem really, I think, if you look at the North Caucasus historically, is that the Russian and Soviet regimes historically managed to offer them something. The Tsarist regimes offered them some form of advancement through military careers or something like that. The Soviet regime offered a far better deal. They offered modernization, education, infrastructure, rights for women, a number of things that were very, very attractive to the North Caucasus. The problem at present is that the Russian leadership is not offering these people anything at all. You have in place a series of corrupt, very tight cliques, often on a clan basis, which have a monopoly on political power. And the social system and the political system is extremely closed, and it's very, very difficult to get one's opinion and one's desires represented in these countries, and the outlet for that is increasingly clandestine. The other factor of this is actually the Russian authorities have clamped down on this in a very Islamophobic way. So young men gathering outside a mosque, anyone with a beard gets rounded up and beaten up in prison overnight. And as a result of this, these Jamaats become these shadow entities, but I would argue that there is nothing intrinsically sinister about them. These are people channeling their grievances through their faith. So I think one has to sort of look at these struggles and try and separate out the elements rather than seeing them as one shadowy whole.
Gentleman in the back.
Hi, my name is Conor Hennebrey. No
particular vested interest or experience in this area. But a question for each speaker. And to Tom, you, I think, rightly point out that independence isn't the most important thing, that improvements to human rights, to economic opportunity, etc., are a greater imperative. But do you believe that those things can really be achieved without a government which is accountable, without a government which has buy-in from the people, with something which, even if it isn't a puppet regime, is clearly a regime which gets its authority other than from the people of Chechnya? And to Tom, you make a good case that, shall we say, Tom's Tony said to Tony, you make a good case that Chechen independence would be a good thing. In practical terms, what do you think can actually be done, given Russia, clearly, its government does not agree? Are you saying that the UK government should actually take action to try to bring about Chechen independence? Do you think that some form of recognition of an independent Chechnya is desired, so that this should somehow be taken up with the UN? It strikes me, given Russia's power and increasing economic influence, short of saying that it's a good thing in very general terms, I'm not sure what exactly we can really do.
Tom, is improvement possible without independence?
Well, interestingly, the former Chechen foreign minister, someone I respect a great deal, Ilyas Akhmadov, wrote a peace plan in which he basically said, okay, we don't want independence anymore. What we want is international protection. And I think this was a very constructive approach, which was actually, unfortunately, ignored by the Russians. But this is also kind of indicative of the way Ilyas had despaired of what had happened to the movement he had been part of. He's now living in Vermont and is in exile and is totally retired, as it were. But I think his point was what Chechnya needs is it's so shattered and its institutions are so leveled that what it needs is some kind of international presence, some kind of international monitoring. And I think that's what, for me, that was what would improve the lives of Chechens enormously. If there could be some kind of, UN human rights monitoring presence in Chechnya to keep an eye on things, and some kind of way of getting in genuine international aid without it being stolen or without it being controlled by the Russians. And I think that's the sort of thing which would be extremely helpful. Obviously, you've got to get past the Russians, which is very difficult. But I think it's easier, possibly, now than it was 2 or 3 years ago.
Tony.
Well, I think, I set out to write this book called The Case for Independence rather than The Path to, because I think that's a much more complicated question and one which requires extensive discussion with people who have much more expertise in these things than I do. But I think one of the first step would be a demilitarization of the Chechnya and a total ceasefire to be observed by all parties. The next thing would be a democratic referendum on the question of independence, just to get that out of the way. And then after that, you have to engage the international community in some meaningful way in order for disasters not to ensue. In terms of the will of Russia, I agree that the Russians are likely to obstruct this and they have a Security Council veto. But on the other hand, if one simply gave up on everything which was opposed by someone powerful in the world, one might as well not get out of bed in the morning. I think very surprising things have happened in history that no one would have expected. I doubt in 1988 that anyone thought the Berlin Wall would come down and that the whole series of communist regimes in Eastern Europe would disappear, and that would have been very much against the will of the Soviet Union at the time. The same applies to all empires that have existed in the world so far. The British weren't keen on losing Africa or India either, but this happened through internal pressure and external pressure.
Ma'am.
Virginia McFadden, now that you've mentioned that, what about the U.S.? Yeah, I don't think I need to spell that out, do I? I mean, what would they do? Yeah, you're talking. Yeah, what would they do? What do you think they would do? In any kind of circumstance you can envision that begins to approach what you would like to see happen.
Well, the first thing they can do, for example, President Bush met last week with Vladimir Shamanov, who is suspected of extensive war crimes in Chechnya. The first thing they could do is not do that sort of thing. second thing they can do would be to have some effective pressure on the Russians in terms of what is actually happening on the ground in Chechnya, rather than applauding the verdict of every rigged referendum that's taken place. I think the record of the international community is so extensively poor that actually doing even the tiniest squeak of protest would be a massive improvement.
You want to take a bite at the apple, sir?
Just want to say something about, follow on about this question about the U.S. The U.S. is afraid of this Islamist threat that has been mentioned by Tom, and I think one really needs to put this to rest. I don't see an Islamist threat. I think this is a red herring that is brought out, and we just using the word frightens the United States, frightens a lot of people. I've lived in Azerbaijan for 14 years. The Azeris from time to time talk about the Wahhabis and the Wahhabist threat. I've yet to meet one in the 14 years I've been there. So, and knowing the way the people in the former Soviet Union simply work, Islam or almost any religion really does not have the deep roots that one would say, are open to an Islamist threat. And certainly I don't think that the North Caucasus has those deep roots.
Well, can I just answer that? In a sense, I kind of used to agree with you, but someone pointed out, I think rather tellingly, that the first constitution of independent Chechnya, so-called independent Chechnya, was based on the constitution of Estonia, and the second one was based on the constitution of Sudan. And what happened in between was a huge amount of violence and horrific violence in Chechnya in between 94 and 96, which I saw. So in a sense, what I think happened was that I absolutely agree with you. In 1994, there was no Islamic radicalism in Chechnya. But by 1996, there was. It was created by war. And then these jihadis who arrived, I mean, probably certainly in lesser numbers than the Russians say, but they were certainly there, and we know many of their names. And as I say, I met one of them. So, unfortunately, the Russians created a problem which wasn't there before. And I also know Azerbaijan, and I also agree with you. There isn't an Islamist movement in Azerbaijan, or a very small one. The problem is that the kind of disemboweling, the kind of destruction of a society that happens in a place which has that kind of war can create that movement. And Chechnya became a jihad almost by accident. And unfortunately, that's a factor we now have to deal with.
One more question for gentleman in the back.
Art, again, thanks. To tie a couple of these threads together, one of the arguments that the Russian government uses is, well, you guys, the U.S., the UN, is doing the same thing we're doing in Afghanistan, for example. And if we just assume for the sake of this argument that what the UN is doing in Afghanistan is the right thing, what is the difference between what's going on in Chechnya and Afghanistan that would justify, let's say, the United States or other countries telling Russia to do something else?
Well, I have a very short answer to that. I don't agree with what's going on in Afghanistan either. So both of these things are wrong-headed and mistaken answers to the problem that exists in those regions. So I'm out.
Sir.
I'm afraid I'm going to be guilty of making a comment rather than asking a question, but it's a ride at what you were saying. I should confess I sit by day in the Foreign Office and so have some insight into the way that governments do approach issues like this. But I have to say I see absolutely no interest whatsoever on the part of any of the permanent members of the Security Council in sponsoring independence for Chechnya. The sort of overwhelming priority seems to be to preserve borders, to keep things intact, and to the extent that we are concerned about human rights issues and maybe sympathetic to the gentleman's argument at the back that independence is helpful to promoting human rights, I think the most that we would probably ever do is put pressure on Moscow to try and improve human rights in Chechnya. But I just have to say, as things stand, I just can't see any other countries seriously campaigning for independence in Chechnya. There's just no interest in it because of the point I made at the start of this question session of the precedent it would set and the number of potential separatist conflicts that it would open up elsewhere in the world.
But can I just return the question about Kosovo? There seems to be some interest in that.
Yes, I have to say Kosovo is the great exception to this, and
East Timor?
now that I'm no longer working on Kosovo, I'm observing it as an interested party, because I do think that this could set a precedent, and the Russians are certainly very conscious of this as well. And we may yet see Russia veto any attempt at Kosovo's bid for independence at the UN Security Council. What's the question you're asking, Lou?
Just raising a couple of other countries, Kurdistan,
Well, I think the same position prevails. A lot would have to change before any permanent member of the Security Council seriously lobbied for creating a new country in the world against the will of the titular nation from which that particular national group wants to secede, including Kurdistan. Well, I'm not going to say any more. It's not my event, but it's just not the way that international relations is conducted, I'm afraid, because the trade-offs are just too high from governments' points of view.
Good. Well, I think the comments of the gentleman from the Foreign Office says it all. Before we wrap up, I'd just like to take a quick poll, totally meaningless, but wondering, first of all, how many of you think Chechnya deserves sovereignty? I think pretty close, sir. Okay, well, let me ask you. Let me ask you my second question, which is, well, go ahead. Tell me why I've loaded the question.
Well, sovereignty is different.
Yeah, or independence. Okay.
I would say the question should be: is independence the main priority? That's loading it. Maybe that's loading it too.
Okay. Let me ask my second question. How many of you think that Chechnya will become independent in the next 5 years? And why do you think so?
I think it would depend on what happens with Kosovo, but it could be that with a change of administration, Washington, perhaps Putin will somehow be got rid of. 5 years is so far out. I just put my hand up for general principle.
Well, go ahead, sir. As a Chechen, you can have the last word.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
We'll have a quick wrap up here.
I was talking to my friend. Could you repeat the question, please?
Why do you think you'll have independence in the next 5 years?
Let me explain you one thing. All the power of pro-Kremlin regime in Chechnya is built on Russians, Kremlin's support, let's say. And if the pressure is put on Kremlin to let Chechnya go free and see what happens, the existing regime in Chechnya will be over during 1 day time. That's my strong belief, and I know what I'm talking about. Because people who are with Mr. Kadyrov at this time, not led by their beliefs or something, they are there because of the high salaries paid in Chechnya, like $700 per month, which is top of the Russian salaries in Russia, even in Moscow. So I know Chechens quite well. I'm Chechen. I know what I'm talking about. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much. Tom?
Yes, I think one of the most interesting conversations that I have had in Chechnya was with a writer who I never saw again. I think he was called Said Hamzat Nunuyev. And I went to see him in January 1994, and he basically said, he used the Russian phrase, we're between two fires here. He said, on the one hand, we have this super Russian neo-imperialism coming out of the Kremlin. On the other hand, we have this disastrous Dudayev regime, which has done nothing for the Chechen people. And he said, it's not going to last. He said, I just hope they don't do the stupid thing and invade. He said, Dudayev will be gone within a year. We'll choose someone better. He'll be a Chechen. We'll still be looking after our own affairs, but we won't have this crazy Dudayev. Unfortunately, he was wrong because the people in the Kremlin were too stupid. But he said, but then he went on to say an interesting thing. He said, but I understand that the people in the villages and the hills who still support this regime. And he said a phrase something like, the people haven't breathed the air of freedom enough. Just give them a bit more time, and then they'll want to have a deal with Russia. And for me, the tragedy was these people sitting in Chechnya in 91, 94. They didn't want independence. They just wanted some kind of respect and freedom to be Chechens after years of oppression. They saw their future within Russia, just as some sort of many Scots see their future within Great Britain, others don't. But I mean, they just wanted some kind of elementary freedom and respect as human beings who'd been through a lot. And for them, for this guy who I think had a correct analysis, independence wasn't viable. The issue is a different one. The issue is about respect and freedom and peace for Chechens.
Tony, your final word.
Well, just to pick up on what Tom was saying, I agree that the motivation would have been a desire for respect, but unfortunately I don't think the Russians were ever going to give it to them, and they're certainly not going to now. I think the thing that the Russians find preposterous, actually, was the idea that Chechens wanted to be treated as equals, and the Chechens think this is perfectly normal and civilized behavior. Unfortunately, the Russians demonstrated their unwillingness to give the Chechens respect by not negotiating properly with Dudayev and invading, and since then they have maltreated the Chechens and killed them in large numbers to the point where I very much doubt Chechens feel respected within the confines of the Russian Federation. So actually, not only is independence not a distraction, it's the indispensable precondition for standing on their own 2 feet and gaining some respect in international terms. The other thing I'd just say in wrapping up is that by and large, the debate on Chechen independence is framed in terms of why they should be allowed this. I think the polarity of this should be entirely reversed. Why not?
Good.
Why not?
Thank you very much, and I want to thank our audience.